The smoke came first. Mara noticed it through the passenger window, maybe 10 minutes before they reached the trailhead. A thin gray column rising from somewhere deep in the pine stand to the east, perfectly vertical in the dead calm July air. She didn't say anything about it. She was still angry at Daniel for the fight they'd had at the gas station, the one that wasn't really about directions. And she was enjoying the silence in the way you can only enjoy silence when someone else is uncomfortable in it. Daniel drove. His hands were too tight on the wheel. He noticed the smoke too, she could tell, because his eyes tracked left for a half-second, and then snapped back to the road the way eyes do, when they're pretending they didn't see something. They parked at the trailhead marker, a wooden post with a brown sign that said Pine Ridge Loop, and climbed out without speaking. The air smelled like summer and pine resin, and something else, something faintly chemical. The kind of smell that doesn't have a name but makes the back of your throat feel like you've bitten a copper coin. "Smell that," Daniel said. "Yes," Mara said. That was all for a while. They walked. The trail ran northeast before bending back toward the ridge, and within 15 minutes the smell grew stronger, and the trees began to thin in ways they shouldn't have. Not the gradual thinning of a natural clearing, but the abrupt absence of trees. As though someone had drawn a circle in the dirt and said, "Nothing lives inside this line." The ground within that radius was scorched and pressed flat, the pine needles fused into a kind of dark glass. At the center of the glass was the ship. She didn't think of it as a ship at first. Her brain tried other words. Structure, object thing, because ship implied intent and scale, and a chain of causation too large to hold. It was maybe 40 feet long, and shaped like nothing she could adequately describe later, in the years when she tried, because its geometry shifted depending on angle and light and some quality of attention she couldn't name. It was dark and wet-looking, though there was no water anywhere near it. It hummed at a frequency just below hearing, something she felt in the bones of her jaw. "We should go back," Daniel said. Mara took 3 steps toward it. Mara, 5 steps. The fused glass crunched under her boots. The heat from the scorched earth came up through the soles, and she could feel it in her ankles. The chemical smell was very strong now, something between ozone and kerosene, and something organic she couldn't isolate. "Mara, please." The ship's surface moved. It didn't open, not like a door opens, not with any hinge or seam. It simply rearranged itself, the way oil rearranges on water. And where there had been a dark, wet wall, there was now a dark, wet gap. And something looked out of the gap at her. She stopped. She had a master's degree in biochemistry. She had spent 4 years studying the chemical machinery of living cells, the way proteins fold and unfold like origami made by a blind man following instructions he cannot read. She had written a thesis on signal transduction pathways, on the ways cells send messages to each other in the dark interior of a body. She was not, by nature or training, a person who froze. She froze. The thing in the gap was approximately the size of a large dog, though it moved in no way a dog moves. It had eyes, or structures that functioned as eyes, set in a head that was too wide and too flat, like a hammerhead arrangement but softer, more fluid. Its skin, if it was skin, was the color of a bruise that has aged past purple into the gray-yellow of old injury. It breathed, or something in its body cycled air, because she could see a rhythmic motion in what she guessed was its thorax. It looked at her for a long time. Then it stepped out of the ship and onto the fused glass and looked at her more. Daniel made a sound behind her that she had never heard from a human being before, and hoped never to hear again. The thing tilted its head. Then, with a deliberateness that read unmistakably as intention, it moved toward her. She should have run. She knew, in the part of her brain that was still operating normally, that the correct response was to run, but the part of her brain that was still operating normally had gotten very small and very quiet, and what filled the space around it was something she identified later as a kind of arrested wonder. The feeling of standing at the edge of something so large that the body forgets, for a moment, that it is mortal. The thing stopped 2 feet in front of her. It smelled like copper and something sweet she couldn't place. It reached out one of its forelimbs, 3-fingered, or 3-appendaged. The distinction felt important later, and touched the side of her face with the tips of those appendages. So lightly she thought at first she had imagined it. Then the world went white, not dark, white. She was aware in the white of moving without moving, of being moved. There was no panic in it. That was the strangest thing, the thing she would circle back to 1,000 times in the following months. There should have been panic. There was instead a sensation of tremendous purpose, of being aimed like a compass needle, of having a direction installed in her the way software is installed. Suddenly present, operational, hers and not hers. She understood in the white that the creature needed something. She did not understand what. She understood that she was being asked to help provide it. She did not understand how she could refuse. Then Daniel hit the thing with a rock. It was a fairly large rock. She saw it afterward, still lie on the fused glass. A piece of granite maybe 10 inches across. Heavy enough that lifting it would have required both hands and something like commitment. He had apparently picked it up, walked the 5 steps from where he'd been standing, and swung it two-handed at the back of the creature's wide, flat head. The creature went down. Not dead. She knew that, immediately, the way you know things in situations where the usual filters between knowing and not knowing are stripped away. It went down the way something goes down when it is surprised rather than damaged. When the shock of an event has temporarily overridden its ability to remain upright. Daniel grabbed her arm. "Run," he said. She ran. She was faster than him. She'd always been faster. A fact that had been a mild domestic joke between them for 3 years, and she pulled ahead almost immediately, her legs doing the thing legs do when fear has removed all the usual hesitations. They crashed through the thin edge of trees at the clearing's boundary and into the full forest and kept going. Branches, root systems. The trail somewhere to their left, she thought, but they weren't on it. Behind them, nothing followed. That was the thing she couldn't reconcile for a long time. Nothing followed. They made it back to the car. Daniel drove. Neither of them spoke for 11 miles, until they hit the county road and Mara said, "We have to tell someone." "Tell them what?" "Tell them what we saw." Daniel said nothing for a long time. Then who do you call for that? She didn't know, she found out. The woman who answered the emergency line at the state's Environmental Monitoring Office was named Beckett. And she was not the person Mara wanted, but she was the person Mara reached. And Mara explained what she had seen using the flattest, most factual language she could manage. Because she had learned early in her scientific training that flat factual language was the only kind that got taken seriously in moments when seriousness was most needed. Beckett listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Can I put you on hold?" Mara was on hold for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, she counted. When Beckett came back, her voice had changed in a way Mara recognized. It had gotten careful. "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm going to need you to stay on the line. There are people who want to speak with you." The people were military. Not visibly military. They arrived in unmarked and wore civilian clothes. But the way they moved, the way they organized themselves in space, the way they communicated in the shorthand of people who have trained together for a long time. Military. The man in charge had a face like a coastline that had been weathering for a long time, and his name, or the name he offered, was Harlan. He listened to her account with the same flat attentiveness he probably brought to everything, and when she was done he said, "And your friend hit it with a rock?" "Yes." "And it went down. Temporarily." Harlan looked at the person next to him for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of look that contains a full conversation compressed into a single exchanged glance. "Okay," he said. "We'd like to take you back there if you're willing." "I'm willing," Mara said. "Why?" said Daniel, from the truck's back seat. She thought about the white, the sensation of direction, the weight of a purpose she hadn't chosen, but hadn't, in the white, wanted to reject. "Because I think it needs something," she said. "And I think we should find out what before it finds someone else to ask." Daniel looked at her for a long time. "It put something in you," he said. "Didn't it?" She didn't answer. She wasn't sure how to answer truthfully. They went back. The ship was still there. The creature was still there. It had not moved from where it had fallen, or it had returned to almost exactly that spot, which amounted to the same thing. Harlan's team formed a perimeter around the clearing's edge, which seemed to her both prudent and vaguely optimistic, because she didn't think a perimeter was going to matter much if the creature decided it wanted to move. She walked to the edge of the fused glass and stopped. The creature's wide head turned toward her. It did not stand. It looked at her from where it lay, and she looked at it, and she tried to be very precise about what she was actually seeing, the way she had been trained to be precise. Because imprecision in observation leads to error in interpretation, and error in interpretation leads to outcomes nobody wants. It was injured. She hadn't processed that the first time. She processed it now. The asymmetry in how it held itself, a compensatory lean to one side that meant something on the other side wasn't right. The same way a person lists away from a sprained ankle without knowing they're doing it. Something in the crash, and it had crashed clearly. The scorched glass and the pressed earth were the marks of a landing that had not gone as planned. Something in the crash had damaged it. It had come out of its ship and touched her because it needed help. Not because it wanted to use her. Because it was hurt and alone on a hostile world, and the first beings it encountered were her and Daniel, and it had tried in the only way available to it, to ask. She understood this the way you understand something that has been in front of you the whole time, but that you couldn't see until the angle changed. She took 4 steps across the glass and crouched in front of the creature, 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the motion of its breathing and the quality of its attention. She put her hands on her knees, palms up. It was a gesture that meant nothing in the creature's language. She was reasonably sure, but it was the gesture she had available. The creature looked at her hands for a long time. Behind her, Harlan said quietly, "Mrs. Vasquez, I'm a biochemist," she said, not to Harlan, more to herself, to whatever it was that was making decisions inside her right now. "I study how things signal each other, how cells ask for things, how biological systems communicate need." She was talking the way she sometimes talked on her lab when she was working through a problem, out loud and to no one, because the act of speaking made the thinking more real. "You're not trying to take anything from me," she said. "You were asking for something. You installed the request in me because it was the fastest way to communicate it. You had no way to know that felt like violation. You had no framework for consent." The creature's head tilted, the same tilt as before. Something in its posture shifted, that lean, that compensatory list, subtly different now. "What do you need?" she said. "Show me slower. Show me like I'm—" She almost said like I'm a child, and then didn't because she thought, no. "Show me like I'm a scientist who hasn't learned your language yet. Like I'm someone who wants to understand but needs more time." The thing reached out one appendage again. Slower this time, so slow it was almost ceremonial. It touched her hand, the upturned palm she'd offered, and what came was not white this time. What came was blue. Blue was calmer. Blue was images she could parse. The ship's interior, something broken in the propulsion system. A component she couldn't name but could see clearly. The ship's equivalent of a fuel line, ruptured. The fluid that should have been flowing through it, pooling instead, in a cavity, where it was slowly doing damage. The creature had been trying to repair it since the crash, and lacked the right tools. Lacked the dexterity in its injured state. Lacked, and this was the part that hit her like cold water, lacked the materials. Because the polymer that had lined the ruptured conduit had vaporized in the crash, and what it needed as a substitute was something with specific properties she could feel in the blue, like a list, like a specification, like a lab protocol. She pulled her hand back. She sat with the blue for a moment, then she said, "Harlan, I need your radio." Harlan didn't move immediately. "Miss Vasquez, I need to understand. It needs a patch material. It's trying to repair its own ship, and it needs a specific kind of polymer. Flexible, high heat tolerance, chemically inert. I need to call someone in my department." Harlan stared at her. "You're describing a biochemistry problem," she said, "which is what I do. Can I have the radio?" It took 4 more minutes than it should have, those 4 minutes filled with the bureaucratic friction of people who were afraid of making the wrong call. Marcia spent those 4 minutes sitting very still on the fused glass, maintaining what she hoped read as a steady and unthreatening presence, while the creature watched her, and she watched the creature and tried to track the subtleties of its breathing. Its breathing was getting shallower. The fluid from the ruptured conduit was doing damage faster than she'd initially estimated. She recalculated. She was not good at pretending her recalculations were less alarming than they were. "Harlan," she said, and something in her voice was different. Was not the voice she used in labs or classrooms, but the voice she used the few times she had needed to say something that could not wait for the usual protocols. "I need to call Dr. Osi right now, or we are going to watch this thing die in this clearing, and I do not think that is the outcome anyone here wants." Harlan held her eyes for a moment. Then he handed her the radio. Dr. Kwam Osi answered on the second call attempt. He was a polymer chemist. He had been her postdoc advisor for 2 years. Had a habit of eating lunch at his desk while watching competitive chess tournaments, and was, she had always believed, the most unflappable person she had ever met. He listened to her describe the material specifications: flexible high heat tolerance, chemically inert, adhesive in a nitrogen-rich atmosphere, and said, "You're describing something close to a fluorosilicone composite. Where are you exactly? What's this for?" "I'll explain later. Can you get it here in the next?" She looked at the creature. "It's breathing. Hour. I have some FEP tubing in the lab. It's not a perfect match, but the properties are close. I can be there in 40 if someone gives me a location." Someone gave him a location. In the end, it was simpler than it should have been, the way the most important things often are. Kwame arrived in his 10-year-old hatchback, wearing a fleece vest and carrying a cooler of material samples. And when he saw the ship, and then the creature, his only visible reaction was to slow his walk slightly and then resume normal speed. He came to stand next to Mara and looked at the creature for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Which material is it going to need?" "I'm going to have to show you," she said. "And showing you is going to be..." She thought about the blue, the sensation of direction, the weight of another mind pressing gently against the inside of hers. "Strange. I do polymer chemistry," he said. "Strange is relative," she explained as best she could. He listened, and then he crouched next to her, and when the creature reached out again, Mara held Kwame's hand and the blue came to both of them, and Kwame said quietly, "Huh. It needs something that can bond under thermal stress without off-gassing. The fee won't do it. But if I could get into the ship..." She relayed this, not through the blue but through gesture, through watching how the creature watched her and adjusting. An improvised semaphore of open hands and pointed fingers. The creature understood or guessed or trusted, which in this moment amounted to the same thing. It rose slowly, asymmetrically, and moved to the ship's opening. Harlan said, "Miss Vasquez, I cannot authorize." "Then don't authorize it," she said, and followed the creature inside. The ship's interior was not what she expected, though she could not have said what she expected. It was not a cockpit in any recognizable sense. It was organic in its organization, the way living things are organized. Not a machine made to contain a life, but something that had grown around the needs of the creature that operated it, the way a nautilus shell grows around the nautilus. The light inside soft, and came from no obvious source. The air was breathable. She took one breath and then another, and noted that her lungs did not object. Different mix from what she was used to, she thought. More nitrogen-heavy. The damaged conduit was obvious once she saw it. A great dark stain spreading from a ruptured line, the viscous fluid it had carried, now coating the surrounding structures in a slow creep. Kwame crouched next to it and opened his cooler, and began sorting through his samples with the focused calm of someone doing a job he knows how to do. She stood in the ship and felt, very clearly, that she was standing at the center of something that would be, for the rest of her life, the reference point against which everything else was measured. This moment, this interior, the smell of the alien fluid, and the soft sourceless light and Kwame's voice saying, "The coefficient of thermal expansion is going to be the problem." The way he said everything, with the flat precision of a man who has decided that panic is a waste of time. The creature stood near the entrance of the ship and watched them. She watched it back. She thought about the blue, about being aimed like a compass, about the difference between being used and being asked, and how sometimes, not always, but sometimes, those things look the same from the outside. She thought about a lab she'd worked in during her second year of graduate school. A very small lab with a broken spectrometer and a PI, who communicated mostly in pointed silences and lab meeting comments that landed like small controlled detonations. She'd learned more in that lab than in any other. She'd learned that precision in hostile conditions is the thing that separates outcomes. She'd learned that you can do good science with broken equipment if you understand what broken means well enough to work around it, she thought. This is broken equipment. The ship, the creature, the language between them. And broken equipment is workable if you understand the breakage. "I think I can make it work with a composite," Kwame said. He had laid out 7 different material samples on the floor of the ship and was cross-referencing them against the specifications the blue had left in Mara's memory, which she relayed to him piece by piece. "The thermal tolerance issue is real, but I can build a sacrificial layer. It won't last forever. Maybe, I don't know how these things work. Maybe a few thousand hours?" She relayed this. The creature looked at her for a long time with its wide hammer-flat head and its eyes that were not quite eyes, and then it made a sound. The first sound it had made in her presence. A low complex vibration that the ship's interior seemed to amplify and shape. She felt it in her jawbones again. She felt it in her chest. She felt it, she realized, in the residue of the blue. The part of the communication that was still inside her, still seated there like a broadcast on a frequency she hadn't known she could receive. The creature wasn't satisfied. The creature was grateful. Those were different things, and she understood, in the moment of distinguishing them, that the creature understood the difference too. "Tell it we understand," she said to herself, to the air of the ship's interior, to whatever was listening. The creature made the sound again, shorter this time, And then it moved toward the damaged conduit, and crouched beside it with qualm, and with three appendaged limbs that trembled slightly with its injury, began to guide him toward the precise points where the composite needed to be applied. They worked for 2 hours. Mara did not work exactly. She translated gestures, sounds, the residual blue whenever it surfaced, the creature's attention whenever it moved, into directions for Kwame, who worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had bracketed the enormity of what was happening and was dealing only with the polymer problem in front of him. She admired this. She had always admired this in him. Harlan's team stayed outside. She could hear them on the radio, the careful language of people managing an unprecedented situation with the tools developed for precedented ones. She did not envy them. She did not think their caution was wrong, exactly. Only that it would not have led to this, to the inside of the ship, to the repair, to whatever was being established in this 2-hour exchange between three creatures who shared no history, no language, no framework, and were building all three things simultaneously in real time. At one point, Kwame said without looking up from his work, "My grandmother used to say that fear of the unknown is just curiosity that hasn't learned its own name." "Your grandmother sounds like she was interesting," Mara said. "She was a chemist," Kwame said. "Family trait," the creature made a sound. She thought, she was not certain, she was parsing a language with a sample size of 3 hours. She thought it sounded like a question. "We're almost done," she said to it. "He's almost done." Kwame applied the final layer of composite. He sat back on his heels and looked at the repair the way he always looked at finished work. Not with satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction implied an expectation had been met, and here no expectation had existed, but with the look of someone who has done what could be done with what was available, and is now calculating honestly what that is worth. "It will hold," he said. "Probably. I'd give it better odds than not." She relayed this through gesture and through whatever channel the blue had opened between her and the creature. The creature's head tilted one more time. Then it stood. Fully, both sides even now the compensatory lean gone, or reduced to something she had to look carefully to detect, and moved to the entrance of the ship. It paused there. It looked at her for a long time. Then it looked at Kwame. Then, with a precision she recognized as deliberate as something chosen, it reached out and touched the back of Kwame's hand, very lightly with those three appendages, and then touched the back of Mara's hand, and then withdrew. Outside, the ship began to make a sound that built slowly from below, hearing into something the whole body could feel. Harlan's team moved back. The fused glass vibrated. The scorched earth around the ship's base began to glow. Mara and Kwame stood at the edge of the clearing, where the glass ended and the forest began, and watched. "What did it take?" Kwame said. "When it touched you the first time, what did it actually take?" She thought about this for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "I don't think it took anything. I think it left something." "What?" She didn't answer immediately because she was trying to be accurate. "The shape of what it needed," she said finally. Like a mold. A negative space. The exact shape of the thing it was asking for, pressed into me so I could recognize it when I found it." Kwame was quiet. "That's a hell of a first contact protocol," he said. "It was panicking," she said. "It was hurt and panicking, and it used the fastest method available. I don't think it had a protocol." "No," he said. "Neither did we." The ship rose. It did not rise the way a helicopter rises. Not the mechanical negotiation with gravity that human flight requires. It rose the way a thought rises. One moment earthbound, the next not, the transition so smooth that the moment of departure was almost impossible to locate. The glow at its base intensified and then contracted, and then the ship was 50 feet above the clearing, and then it was 100, and then it was gone, not gradually but completely, as though it had remembered it belonged somewhere else and simply gone there. The clearing was quiet. The fused glass was still warm under Mara's feet. The smell of copper and something sweet hung in the air, thinning slowly. Harlan came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "We're going to need your account of everything that happened in there." "I know," she said. "Both of you. I know. There are going to be people who want to." He stopped, started again. "This is going to be complicated." "Harlan," she said, "I'm a biochemist. I study how living systems communicate. I have spent my entire professional life on the problem of how one kind of organism signals another in a language neither of them fully understands." She looked at where the ship had been, the pressed earth and the warm glass and the pine trees at the clearing's edge still standing, unharmed, holding whatever they knew. "I just did my job." He looked at her for a long time. Then he almost smiled, which she thought was probably as close to a smile as the coastline of his face could manage. "Write it up," he said. Daniel was sitting on the hood of one of the trucks at the tree line, which was where he had been for the past 2 hours, which was also probably where he needed to be. He had a paper cup of coffee that someone had given him, and he was holding it with both hands and looking at the place where the ship had been. She sat next to him on the hood. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun. "Okay," she said. "I hit an alien with a rock," he said. "You did. It was the only thing I could think of." "It worked," she said. "It got us out of the clearing. I panicked." "Yes," she said. "But you panicked in my direction. You panicked toward me." She thought about the blue. About the creature's gratitude, which she was not yet sure she had read correctly, but which she was fairly sure she had. That's a specific kind of panic. Not everyone can do it. He looked at her. "You went back in the ship." "Yes." "You helped it fix its ship." "Yes." "And then it left." "Yes." He was quiet for a while. He drank some of the coffee. It was probably terrible coffee. Emergency site coffee always is. But he drank it like it was keeping him anchored to something, and she understood that, because she was doing the same thing with the residue of the blue, holding the feeling of it the way you hold on to the last image of a dream that is already fading. "What did it feel like," he said, "when it touched you?" "Blue," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said, "but that's the most accurate word I have." She thought about it more. She thought about the shape of the thing it had pressed into her. The precise negative of its need, installed in her like a mold. And about how that mold was still there. She could feel it, not intrusively but present, the way a scar is present. Not a wound anymore. Just the record of one. She thought, "I did not ask for this." She thought, "I would not give it back." "I think," she said carefully, because she wanted to be honest, because honesty in observation is the foundation of everything. "I think it saw us, and it was afraid. And it did the only thing it could think of to ask for help. And it was not the best choice, not the most careful or the most considered, but it was what it had. And we helped it anyway." Daniel sat with this. He was a quiet man in the way some people are quiet. Not from reserve, but from genuine comfort with silence, from a belief that thoughts deserve time to settle before they're spoken. It was one of the things she had known for years, and had in the ordinary friction of life, sometimes forgotten. "I threw a rock at an alien," he said. "You did, and it still let us help it." "It did," he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. It was the same word Harlan had used, but it meant something different the way he said it. It meant, "I am placing this in the category of things that happened, things that are now part of the record, things I will carry without necessarily understanding." "Yeah," she said. "Okay." The afternoon was tilting toward evening. The clearing was quiet. The pine trees stood in their dark colonnades, holding whatever they held. Somewhere in the middle distance, a bird had decided that the last 2 hours hadn't happened, and was making the argument loudly. And at length, Kwame came to sit on the other side of her. He had his cooler of material samples, and a small notebook in which he had been writing. She could see the handwriting. Dense, precise. The handwriting of someone who has learned to keep records out of respect for the fact that memory is imperfect, and imperfection has consequences. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Material properties," he said. "What worked, what I had to improvise, what the variance was. If this ever happens again," he paused. "When this ever happens again," the composite held. "That's worth documenting." She thought about this. She thought about all the data she carried in her own body. The blue, the mold of the creature's need, the residue of a communication that had no human analog. And she thought, "I should write this down too. Not for the debrief, not for Harlan's report, not for the official account that would be written by people with clearances and redacted until it was something clean and manageable. For the record. For the next person who stands at the edge of a clearing smelling copper and something sweet, trying to understand what is looking at them out of the dark." "I'm going to need paper," she said. Kwame, without looking up, offered her his notebook and a pen. She wrote. The sky over the pine ridge went orange and then pink, and then the deep even blue of a summer night arriving. And the stars came out one by one and then all at once, the way they do when you're somewhere dark enough to see them properly. Mara looked up at them between sentences, at the particular stars she had always known, and the particular stars she could not name, but which she now understood, were not simply beautiful and remote but traversable, crossable, places that creatures could leave from, and travel through and arrive at. Harlan's team was still there, still in their perimeter, doing the careful administrative work of an unprecedented event. Someone had brought better coffee. Someone had set up lights. The fused glass at the center of the clearing reflected the lights back in soft scattered patterns. She wrote until she couldn't see clearly. Then she stopped and sat in the dark and listened to the forest and felt the residue of the blue, which had faded from an active presence to something more like a memory of a sound. Not the sound itself anymore, just the shape of where it had been. She thought. Something that needed help found something that could help it, and asked and was helped. That is the whole of what happened, she thought. That is not small. She thought about a paper she had written in her second year of graduate school on the biochemistry of receptor binding. The way a signal molecule fits into a receptor the way a key fits a lock. Not because either the molecule or the receptor knows it is a key or a lock, but because the shapes happen to correspond. Because the chemical universe has arranged things such that certain structures recognize each other across the darkness of a cell. She had not at the time thought of it as a story. She thought of it as a mechanism. She thought about the blue, about the creature's need pressed into her like a mold, about the way Kwame had crouched in the dim interior of the ship and built a repair out of materials, never intended for it, and made it hold probably, well enough to get something home. She thought, we are apparently compatible. Not in the way we imagined. Not in the science fiction way, the shared language and culture way, the dramatic first contact ceremony way. Compatible in the simpler way. In the way that two structures can recognize each other across a darkness neither of them can fully see, she thought. That might be enough. That might be what enough looks like from the beginning. The bird in the middle distance had stopped its argument. The forest was very quiet. Daniel had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Because Daniel could sleep anywhere, always had, would probably sleep in the back of the truck on the way home, and wake up with the particular bewilderment of someone who'd slept through something important, and was now trying to reconstruct what. She let him sleep. She sat with the dark and the stars and the warm residue of the blue and the notebook full of her precise, careful handwriting, and she was not afraid. She would be later. The fear would come when the adrenaline was gone, and the ordinary light of an ordinary morning hit, and the reality of what had happened tried to integrate itself with the ordinary structure of her life. The fear would come, and it would be real, and she would sit with it the way she sat with everything difficult, which was patiently, and with the understanding that patience is not the absence of feeling, but its discipline. But now in the dark she was not afraid. She was interested. She was the kind of interested she had been at 7 years old in the Natural History Museum, standing in front of the whale skeleton, neck craned back, trying to take in the whole of something too large to see at once, not overwhelmed by the scale, enlarged by it, made larger by the act of trying to comprehend it. She looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, something was going home. Something carried a repair made of human materials, improvised, imperfect, built in 2 hours by a man in a fleece vest who'd been called away from his lunch and was going home. She hoped it made it. She was fairly sure. She had been trained to be precise about uncertainty, to distinguish between fairly sure and certain and almost certain, and willing to bet everything on it. She was fairly sure it would. She closed the notebook. She looked at the stars for a while longer. Then she said, to no one, to the clearing, to the pine trees, and the fused glass, and the pressed earth, and the lingering smell of copper, and something sweet that was finally slowly thinning into the clean summer air. Come back when you can. She didn't know if anything heard her. She thought probably not. She thought the universe was mostly indifferent, mostly dark, mostly operating on rules that were not oriented toward human wishes. But she also thought, something found us today, in this clearing, on this planet, and we were not what it expected, probably, and it was not what we expected. Certainly, and we helped each other anyway, with rocks and polymer composites, and the particular stubbornness of creatures who do not know how to stop trying. That, she thought, is worth something. That, she thought, is worth quite a lot.